Today, we're going to break down a really powerful text. Think of it as a kind of moral audit of the last 100 years, one that holds a mirror up to all of us. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about trying to understand where we've been so we can have a real conversation about where we're going. Let's dive in.
Does this feel familiar? I mean, that feeling of just constant noise, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, but no clear path forward. The source we're looking at today actually argues that this feeling, this exact moment of frustration, is where real change begins. It's the point where we can finally start turning all that noise into something meaningful.
So, let's look at our report card for the last century. We were definitely ambitious, right? We built massive empires. We split the atom. We connected the entire globe. But the argument here is that for all our progress, we were seriously lacking in wisdom. Our technology grew up way faster than our morals did. This whole analysis isn't about how powerful we became, but what we actually did with that power.
What's really interesting is how the source identifies these repeating patterns of failure, and they show up everywhere, across all kinds of cultures. The first one is this: power without humility. It's that moment when strength just turns into entitlement, when the ability to do something becomes its own justification, and things like restraint or caution are seen as weaknesses.
And then there's the second pattern: identity without ethics. This is when the question of who we are, our nation, our tribe, our group, becomes way more important than the question of how we behave. Our loyalty to the team started to matter more than our commitment to doing the right thing.
And that leads us right into the third major failure: security without justice. This is the idea that our safety, the comfort and security of our group, can be used to justify pretty much anything, even the suffering of others. And according to the source, that's a bargain that always leads to moral decay.
So what happens when you mix those three things together? Power without humility, identity without ethics, and security without justice. Well, this is what you get. The 20th century wasn't a failure of intelligence. We were smart enough. The source argues it was a massive failure of moral courage. Okay, so let's see how these big ideas played out in the real world. In this next part, the source holds up a mirror to some specific nations and ideologies. And again, the goal here isn't to accuse or blame, but to spark some honest reflection. The idea is simple. You can't build a better future if you're not willing to take a clear-eyed look at the past.
For Muslim societies, the source paints a picture of a century filled with trials. Just look at this table. On one side, you have these immense external pressures: colonization, borders drawn by outsiders, resources being stripped away. But, and this is crucial, it also calls for honesty about the internal failures. Things like deep divisions, a real fear of self-criticism, and religion being used as a tool for political control.
Now turning to America, the source frames its story as a kind of central tragedy. On one side, you have these incredible, world-changing aspirations, truly beautiful ideals. But on the other side, you have a reality that has consistently and often brutally fallen short of them. The tragedy isn't just that America failed. The source suggests it's that America, at its very core, has always known better.
Okay, so to really get the next part of this analysis, we have to be super clear about some distinctions the source makes. It's really important. First, Judaism is a religion, a faith. Second, Jews are a people, an ethnicity. And third, Zionism is a political project, an ideology, with many different versions and interpretations. Keeping these separate is absolutely key for what comes next. So using that very specific framework, the source then asks a series of deeply uncomfortable questions. And these questions are aimed at one particular strand of that political project. The first one is this: at what point does an ideology become so fragile that it starts to see any internal criticism not as a sign of health, but as an act of total betrayal?
And that leads directly to this next question. When does the voice of conscience within a group, that internal moral debate, get shut down and dismissed as just a form of self-hatred? The source argues that any ideology that gets to this point, where it can't handle any dissent from within, is putting itself in some very real, long-term danger.
All right, so after laying out this whole diagnosis of the last century's moral failures, the source makes a big pivot. Because it's not enough to just point out what's broken, right? The real question is, what are we going to do about it? This next part is all about how we can move from just being outraged to actually reflecting and then turning that reflection into action.
This slide pretty much sums up the huge shift the source is calling for. Think about it. So much of our public conversation today runs on the model in column 1. Pick a side first, think about it later. Get rewarded for being the loudest and the angriest. The alternative, column 2,
is way harder, but it's what's needed. Think deeply before you give your allegiance. Reward reflection, not just rage.
So where do we even begin? Well, the path forward that's offered here is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. It's not about some grand gesture. It's about a personal commitment to these 5 things: to read, to think for yourself, to write down your thoughts, to respond to others, and finally, to participate in building something better. And that brings us to the conclusion. This whole thing isn't a political movement or some new campaign. The source frames its final message as something much more personal. It's an invitation. An invitation for us to grow up, morally, to move beyond the easy, simple answers and start embracing the tough, messy complexity of real wisdom. So what does that wisdom even look like? Well, it's not loud, it's not flashy. It's the quiet courage to ask these kinds of hard questions. It's that little voice inside that forces you to stop and think about the consequences, to think about who pays the price, and to reflect on what our choices really say about the kind of people we are.
And this quote, this really gets to the absolute heart of it. Real peace, real justice, real progress, they're not going to come from just shouting slogans or using force or building the next new thing. They have to come from a much deeper place, a real commitment to our moral purpose.
And so, this is where the source leaves us. The last 100 years have been a painful and, frankly, a repetitive lesson in what happens when we have power without wisdom. The choice, right now, is ours. Are we ready to finally learn from it, or are we just setting ourselves up to repeat the whole cycle all over again? The future isn't written yet. We're the ones writing it.